This is a regular engagement of government officials, international organizations, development specialists, human rights, and other experts to provide insights on the world of work. Today's event is entitled Women's Empowerment, Workers' Rights in a Post-Pandemic World, in which our distinguished speakers will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the global labor market and what critical policy responses to empower women and provide for a greater voice and representation in the world of work are needed at this time. Our program will begin in just 2 minutes. Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's edition of the ILO Global Discussion Series entitled Women's Empowerment and Workers' Rights in a Post-Pandemic World. My name is Kevin Cassidy. I am the director of the ILO Office for the United States and Canada, based here in Washington, D.C. Today's conversation is broadcast live via Zoom, as well as streamed on LinkedIn and YouTube of the ILO's social media platforms. Today's event will be recorded and available at the ILO USA Canada website for viewing subsequent to this event. Globally, women have been disproportionately hit in terms of job losses, reflected by a drop in women's employment of nearly 54 million jobs. The pandemic has also shed light on the large gender gaps in the equality of employment, especially for many women working in specific sectors and occupations, as well as the informal economy, and the increased care demands to which women contribute to and bear the brunt of unpaid care work. For its part, the ILO within the international system has advanced a human-centered recovery for the world of work, which seeks to create inclusive and sustainable economic growth and employment, to protect the workers' rights globally, providing social protection floors, and increasing dialogue among workers, employers, and governments. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to our distinguished moderator for today's discussion, Harold Meyerson. Mr. Meyerson is the editor-at-large for the American Prospect, a former op-ed columnist for the Washington Post, and one of the most influential commentators in the U.S. on labor and social issues. Mr. Meyerson, the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of my magazine, the American Prospect, which long has covered the very issues which we are discussing today. Today, we are going to be hearing from representatives of nations that might be viewed within the industrialized world as the alpha and omega of workers' rights, to wit, Sweden and the United States. We'll be hearing from distinguished officials who have long advocated both for increased workers' rights and increased women's rights and women's equality within the trade union movement, within the larger society, and dealing with this right at the end of, or let's hope near the end of, a global pandemic which has really shaken up labor relations and highlighted gendered issues throughout the world. I have a colleague at the American Prospect, David Dayan, who is writing a piece on the record number of Americans who have quit their jobs in recent months. This may be how a largely non-union workforce goes on strike, but it's a record level. And he noted in his research that in the aftermath of the Black Death, the bubonic plague of the 14th century, that there was a period where the number of workers in the labor force had been so diminished that briefly there was an increase of worker incomes and rights even then. And we were wondering if anything like that might be happening now. Today, the people you'll be hearing from are expert not only in these dynamics within their own nations, but specifically around the world. We will be hearing from the Foreign Minister of Sweden, Ann Linde, and 3 Americans charged with the international responsibilities of the Labor Department, the AFL-CIO, and the U.S. Business International Council, whose name I think I just screwed up, but I will get it right the next time I say it. With that, I am delighted we're going to have a presentation from Sweden's Foreign Minister, Ann Linde, and to introduce her, we are going to go to the Swedish Embassy in Washington, D.C., and hear from the Swedish Ambassador, Karen Olastather. So, Ms. Ambassador Olastather, the floor is yours. I don't think your mic is on, Ms. Olastather.
So there, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Harold. Now, greetings from the embankment of the Potomac here in Georgetown. Not lovely weather today, but makes good for conversation instead. So it's really such a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to thank the ILO office for USA and Canada, Kevin, for hosting us, and also a big thank you to all the speakers who are taking part today. And Thea, it's always a pleasure to see you too, even though it's on screen today. And I'm also very pleased to have AFL-CIO Kathy here with us, and private sector representative from the U.S. Council for International Business, Gabriella. And of course, I hope that this tripartite setting makes you feel at home, Kevin, because it does that for me, really. And I'm sure for Minister Linde when she speaks in a moment as well. So the timing of this conversation is really timely because Sweden is heading up the ILO governing body at a time when everybody, as you noted, is talking about the labor market and workers' rights as well. And here in the US, we are, of course, preparing for President Biden's Summit for Democracy in December. And I'm really pleased to say that Sweden is gearing up to support the summit in a very active way, not least when it comes to women's political participation and women's rights. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with the discussion we will have today. The Swedish government has pursued a feminist foreign policy since 2014. So we know that to advance the status of women is also to advance the status of democracy, to paraphrase Vice President Harris. And speaking about our feminist foreign policy, I really have the great honor to introduce the Foreign Minister of Sweden, Ann Linde. And Minister Linde has, through all her career, various jobs within the Swedish government, also for the Social Democratic Party, having served as Minister of Trade and EU Affairs, and since 2 years, a Minister of Foreign Affairs. I think Ann is one of the strongest champions, I would almost say globally, Ann, for women's rights, democracy, and women's participation in all walks of life when it comes to policy, when it comes to peace negotiations, and all those matters. So I think we could not have a better champion with us today talking about these extremely important issues. So really, over to you, Ann. And you are muted. Maybe it's a Swedish thing.
The Swedish ladies don't know how to unmute. Well, anyway, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you, Karen, for the nice words. I'm very pleased to discuss and listen to your perspective. Today's topic is one that is very close to my heart, since it's about women's empowerment and human rights in the workplace, and about the key role of trade union. Sweden pursues these issues vigorously and in multilateral context, such as the UN and European Union, and of course the OSCE, where I'm now the chairperson in office. My government has also strengthened the focus on labor rights and human rights in our foreign policy as part of our Drive for Democracy initiative. The International Labour Organization is a key partner in this area, and as the ambassador said, my country has been a partner to the ILO for a very long time. The Global Deal, which was launched by the Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven in 2016, is our concrete contribution to foster change and social dialogue. The Global Deal aims to reduce inequality, create well-paying jobs, and foster conditions for long-term growth through social dialogue between government, companies, and employees. I welcome the Biden administration's clear focus on democracy, human rights, including workers' rights. President Biden's Summit for Democracy is coming up, and to me, the topics that we are discussing here today are at the core of what democracy is. Sweden has traditional industries and tech companies, and we also have many entrepreneurs in innovation tech, such as fintech and green tech. Many of those entrepreneurs are women. There are three aspects that I would like to raise here today, where the importance of strong unions are an integral part in all three. Firstly, it's about giving everyone a voice. I would like to discuss how we can promote social dialogue in all its forms. I've already mentioned the Global Deal Initiative, a platform for promotion of global dialogue worldwide. I want to point out that this is not about exporting the Swedish labor market model. Every country has its unique national context. The shape and form of dialogue between labor market stakeholders will ultimately depend on factors such as the level of unionization, the size of informal sector, and so on. Social dialogue is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather a concept that highlights the benefits of dialogue over conflict. Be it in Sweden, in the supply chain of multinational companies in Bangladesh, or in the growing gig economy in the US. In many countries, including my own, the pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of women in the workplaces and in the home. It has also demonstrated the need for allowing everyone a seat at the table. Union rights are human rights. Secondly, I would argue that there is another key word in the post-pandemic world when focusing on women: skills. If we do not focus on building up skills to empower women, we cannot tackle the challenge of the future. Unions can be a key here. In my country, unions play a vital role in assessing needs among workers and providing tailor-made solutions to building up skills in partnership with employers funded by the government. Post-pandemic, we know that many workers have decided to make changes in their lives. Some want to study, others want to take up a different job than they had before. This in many ways is a positive development if support that workers need when they are looking to enhance their skills. I would argue that I would like to hear the private sector perspective on this. And that's the labor market that will be going through an even greater shift as we move towards a fossil-free economy, and that employers worldwide will need to be strategic about upskilling and reskilling to remain productive. Thirdly, we have to strive to build a society where workers can look at the future without fear. There is a change everywhere. Emerging technologies, automation, clean energy, and climate transition. These could all be seen as threats, but are they? Are they not opportunities? I believe that the economic recovery, which is now taking place, is an opportunity. I think we will be seeing green investments, new jobs, and if we create a dialogue between stakeholders, a foundation for a more sustainable society, I believe a free trade agenda will support this. Unions can create opportunities for social change and better jobs if we adopt the mindset that we place the worker at the center, not the job. Promoting social dialogue and the role of unions has been a cornerstone for us, and is something that the social partners in Sweden are engaged in worldwide, both employers and unions. Women around the globe play a vital role, and the sooner we recognize this, the easier it will be. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your ideas now and to discuss them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Linda. We are delighted to have had you here. One comment you made that I distresses me just a little is you said you weren't trying to export the Swedish active labor market. I wish you could. That has long seemed to me as a distant student of Sweden, something that would definitely improve American living standards, work relations, and you name it. What we are now going to do is hear from three distinguished Americans who deal with labor issues both in the United States and abroad for several minutes. Then we're going to go to a question back and forth in which our audiences will be able to pose questions as well through the Zoom question and answer function. So I'm going to introduce each of them as just before they speak. The first speaker, who actually is an old friend of mine, is Thia Lee, who's the Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs at the United States Department of Labor, a position within the Biden administration. Thia, if I may call her by her first name, since I have known her for 20 some years. Thia formerly was the president of the Economic Policy Institute, which is a progressive think tank here in Washington, D.C. Before that was longtime trade expert at the American Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO, and Deputy Chief of Staff there. So with no further ado, Thia, welcome, and what have you to say?
Good morning, Harold, and good morning to all the guests. And thank you so much, Minister Linda, Ambassador Olastather. What a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with all of you today on this interesting and important topic. So if we're talking about, and I so much appreciate being here with Sweden and Sweden's leadership with the Global Deal and also your partnership with the Summit for Democracy, which we are very excited about. We are excited to also highlight the role that unions can play in building vibrant and sustainable democracies. And we're going to, looking forward to having an important role in that Summit for Democracy. When we think about the pandemic and women's empowerment and worker rights, I was thinking about it two ways. What has changed? What changed during the pandemic? And my answer was everything and nothing. And just to start with the nothing, that most of what, as Minister Linda was talking about, the fragility and the inequality that was exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic, much of that existed before the crisis. It was laid bare, it was made worse, it was heightened by the public health crisis and the economic downturn, because we saw the disproportionate impact, especially on women, but also on people of color, on migrant workers, basically on more vulnerable, low-wage workers in the US, but also around the world. And in the United States, we saw that 40 years of wage stagnation, the upward redistribution of income to CEOs in the top 1% and the top 0.1%, also the attacks on unions, the erosion of labor laws, the weaponization in some ways of the gig economy, of employers taking advantage of digitalization to take away workers' rights, whether it's the right to unionize or the right to privacy or the right to have controlled hours or decent wages. the erosion of the minimum wage over those years and the purchasing power in the United States of the minimum wage. So we saw so many things happening. And really one of the things that we saw was a tremendous shift of risk from employers to workers, where employers no longer owned the cars or hired the workers, but are trying to shift that responsibility to individual workers. And when the pandemic hit, all of that came home to roost in a very disturbing and troubling way. That we saw that and also the other thing, which was the failure to invest in infrastructure and in skills for many decades in the United States, left us vulnerable. And the supply chains, we saw the overconcentration of global supply chains, and also the terrible working conditions in many places, were all fragilities and vulnerabilities that existed before the pandemic. But I hope, and I agree with Minister Linda, that this is an opportunity for us to learn lessons and to go forward in a different way. And of course, the Biden-Harris administration talks about building back better, which is a little bit corny, but it is actually a really important way of thinking about this opportunity. And I think particularly when we think about women in the labor market and women in the economy, that we saw that, and Harold mentioned it in his opening remarks, that the kind of shift in power in the labor market and the shift in people's willingness to work at crappy jobs with terrible schedules, with unsafe conditions, and without decent childcare. All those things have changed the equation, the way that we're thinking about what will it take to bring people back into this labor market. And hopefully it will take some pretty big changes. And we've seen some of that is on the table right now in front of the US Congress. We have the big infrastructure bill, which we hope will get a vote this week. But we also have, just as importantly, the Build Back Better bill, which also includes some of those key elements that I hope we'll talk more about in this hour, which is having a strong care economy, a professionalized care economy with decent wages for workers is important to bring women back into the labor market, but it's also important for employers. And so, I'm really thrilled that we have the opportunity to create our tripartite dialogue here today, the social dialogue, with Gabriella representing the employer community and Kathy representing the labor movement. And I'm here, of course, on behalf of the US government. So let me pause there and just say, going forward, just to outline what we're looking for in the very short term, I think we did learn in terms of lessons from the pandemic that not having paid time off or universal health care or adequate and expansive unemployment insurance are crucial elements that any economy needs if there's going to be future pandemics, and I'm afraid there will. And then in the medium term, looking to what Kevin talked about, the human-centered recovery, investing in clean energy, good jobs, skills, care, a professional care economy, so that we can have the kind of safety, voice at the workplace, and unions that will make the recovery robust, resilient, and sustainable. So let me pause there and look forward to my colleagues' comments.
Here we go. See, it is not just Swedes who start talking when they're still muted. I'm a lifelong American. I just did it myself. And now is a very easy transition to go from Thia's presentation to that of Kathy Feingold, who is the Director for International Affairs at the AFL-CIO. Long has played a major role in the world's labor movements, and is in a terrific position perhaps to contrast and compare what we have here in this country to other countries that we deal with. So with no further ado, Kathy, enlighten us.
Thanks, Harold. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to the ILO and to Sweden. How fantastic to be on a panel with actually two governments talking about workers' rights, a feminist agenda. It is really fantastic. So many thanks, and very appreciative of the opportunity to talk with everyone today. As we've already heard, the pandemic really brought together a set of crises. They were intertwined. We were already talking about income, gender, racial inequality, the climate crisis. We have everyone at the COP, and I'm just getting the readouts about the work we've done to get just transition pledges, which I think will be key to women workers. We also saw attacks on civil society spaces and democracy, which has really impacted women workers in many countries around the world. So all of these crises have had an impact on gender equality. The numbers, we've already heard some people talk about them. The global snapshot is pretty enormous. Women lost around $800 billion in income during the pandemic. It's the combined GDP of 98 countries. So we know that women were on the forefront of really being impacted on what happened at the in the pandemic. Now, the question is, as governments have been talking about what to do, were women at the table helping to shape those policies? I hope in Sweden, because you have a commitment to a feminist agenda, they were there making sure that there was gender sensitive policies that have been going forward. But I would say if you look at the global snapshot, it's been quite mixed. Many women still are not at the table. We've seen large differences across sectors of work and regions. The Americas region actually saw the highest decline in women's employment, followed by Arab states. And when we think about how many women workers depend on the informal economy of work, one thing I want to point out is when you close civil society spaces, when there are attacks on democracy, many workers can't even get out of the house to work. And so some of the reports we saw were that many governments used the pandemic as a way to justify further restricting worker and human rights. Over 150 countries enacted provisions limiting freedom of assembly, which meant informal economy workers, women selling in the streets. They had a harder time, domestic workers, getting to work. And so what we are seeing is governments taking advantage of the pandemic, hopefully Sweden and the US, to think about building back better, as Thia says, about thinking of a transformative economic model. And at the same time, we see many countries using the pandemic as an excuse to close civil society spaces and make it harder for workers. And we see that around the world. Before the pandemic, we already know that women already perform 3 times as much unpaid care work as men, and this has just grown. I want to bring in the issue of gender-based violence. I know we will have the opportunity to have another panel on this, but this was linked to what has been going on during the pandemic, a rise in gender-based violence. And out of the 580 fiscal and economic measures created by countries to support businesses, only 70 of them focused on strengthening women's economic security. So we have a long way to go before we get that transformative feminist agenda, Minister, that I hope you will spread around the world. Let me tell you what we're calling for in the global labor movement. I also wear another hat at the International Trade Union Confederation as Deputy President, and we've come together demanding the creation of millions of decent care jobs, the formalization of informal care jobs, recognizing the rights of all care workers to decent work and working conditions, the right to collective bargaining, access to public quality care services. And we've heard this from others, investing in care, health, education, child. Millions of new jobs can be created in the care economy. Let me end, Harold, by saying I want to actually highlight a few good examples, because we've said some negative examples. Here's some good examples of what we'd like to see replicated around the world. Many governments have actually increased the compensation of healthcare workers, many of them women, through allowances and additional grants, either on a permanent basis like France or temporary basis, Argentina, Canada, Italy, and other countries. Australia and South Korea increased the availability of childcare facilities for unemployed parents and low-income families. Other countries like France, Italy, and Netherlands, they increased and reformed their paternity leave to bring it on par. And other countries, Brazil, Burkina Faso, implemented unconditional cash transfers for informal economy workers. These are the kind of policies that we are going to need to see on a permanent basis. Minimum wages were adjusted upward in Germany, Japan, and Mexico. So let me end by saying that I think what we need, if we're going to talk about coming out of the pandemic, the rights of women workers, building power for all workers and their families, we need a transformative economic agenda. one that is really different, that puts workers, that puts gender equity at the heart of it. And so I look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone. Thanks so much.
Amen, Kathy. Thank you for a very enlightening discussion. And I'm reminded, by the way, that in the 1930s, Sweden and the US were two of the very few countries that didn't practice austerity, which only sent countries deeper into depression, but actually followed a kind of Keynesian policy. I wish the path of the two countries had continued in a parallel rather than perhaps perpendicular direction since then. All right, enough from my aside. Now we are going to hear from Gabriela Rigg Herzog, who is, you have a complicated title, the Corporate Responsibility and Labor Affairs Vice President for the U.S. Council for International Business. Lord knows the U.S. is in a sense the capital of international business, and that creates all kinds of interesting issues. So with that, Gabriela, let us hear from you.
Thank you so much, Harold. And let me join with the other panelists in thanking the government of Sweden and the International Labor Organization, especially Kevin's team at the ILO USA Canada office in Washington, for organizing today's event. It's really an honor to be here today representing the United States Council for International Business on this prestigious panel. Let me join with the others in offering some statistics to frame, today's discussion. I mean, the most obvious is that women represent more than half of the world's population and therefore more than half of its potential. Yet, according to the World Bank, in 2019, the year before the pandemic, women were over a third less likely to be in the labor force than men. And that figure has been broadly unchanged over the past 2 decades. And it's only gotten considerably more challenging for women because, as the speakers have clearly noted, women and girls have been disproportionately and negatively impacted by the pandemic. As the B20, the business coordination group that feeds into the G20 deliberations, as the B20 emphasized last month in its policy paper on its special initiative on women empowerment, we need to recognize that pre-pandemic, women's opportunities were held down by the burden of unpaid work, by discrimination and harassment, and by outdated laws and socio-cultural norms. Worse, even among those women who do reach paid employment, they are less likely to work full-time, less likely to work in key high-growth sectors such as engineering and technology, and less likely to reach senior leadership positions. This just doesn't make sense for our societies or our economies. The IMF found that at every level, but especially at the decision-making levels, greater gender diversity has been linked with a host of benefits, from increased national productivity and export diversification to innovation and corporate growth. We know this. Diversity inclusion policy and inclusion policies are good for business and can contribute to the competitiveness, productivity, and sustainability of companies. This is also well understood. The data is there, and that those are opportunities that we should all want to see happen for our shared recovery. So what is going on? From our perspective, the most common challenges continue to be how women's roles at work and at home are stereotypically seen in society, lack of access to basic and higher education, especially in the STEM field, lack of access to affordable childcare services, lack of support to re-enter the labor market, lack of access to credit for starting a business for women entrepreneurs in particular, lack of access to business networks and opportunities, and lack of access to information on support services. Addressing these challenges are our shared mandate, and USCIB contributes to this effort through engagement with and supporting our members. We also engage on these issues in collaboration with our peers within our international affiliates and in the multilateral system as the U.S. representative of U.S. employers to the ILO, and also at the OECD and within the UN system. We recognize the shared responsibility of governments, employers, and workers in this effort, and we particularly underscore the foundational role governments play. Sound national institutions are especially key, characterized by good governance, rule of law, transparency, and strong anti-corruption practices. Among employers' specific recommendations to design a recovery that truly supports women's economic empowerment are support for women's return to the post-pandemic workforce and advocacy for gender balance across high growth, high impact activities, such as the design, development, and delivery of health and advanced technologies. We also recommend boosting women's economic opportunities by eliminating legal and cultural barriers to paid work and actively upskilling female workers. We also recommend mitigating the barriers that limit the ability of women to advance, lead, and start businesses. So to repeat, in responding to the pandemic, we need to support the full potential of women to achieve inclusive economic growth that benefits all. These recommendations I just shared are just a start, but if they were implemented by governments, they would help us make progress in these shared goals of strengthening the capacity of democratic institutions, promoting workforce development, and encouraging social dialogue to build an inclusive society that looks ahead to empower women workers. Thanks, and I look forward to the continued discussion.
Well, thank you, Gabriella. And what we are now going to do is I am going to ask some questions of our panelists, and people viewing this panel can also forward questions via the question and answer function on Zoom. And Kevin Cassidy of the ILO will forward those questions to me. And that means we can have lots of questions. We do not, however, have all that much time. So the way we're going to balance this is I'm going to quickly ask questions, and let's hope the answers are within 90 seconds, perhaps utopian hope. And I'm going to begin by asking a ferociously complicated question to our Swedish foreign minister, Ms. Linda. And that is, a lot of what we've been hearing about over the past 40 minutes has been the existence of a dual labor market in which women are often relegated into jobs that are not as remunerative and out in most countries less organized into trade unions, and really creating two strata, not just women, but minorities, immigrants as well. How has Sweden dealt with this? Because Sweden has been generally an example of a more solidaristic economy. So in 90 seconds, how would you describe the Swedish attempt to address problems that arise when you have a dual labor market that is gendered and racialized?
Well, thank you very much. I think actually that the answer very much lies in the social dialogue, and to have both the trade unions, the employers, and the government working together. I think it's very, very important that we are actively engaging in trade unions and getting the labor market to work in a positive way, and that we always have the gender glasses on. I mean, we have a feminist foreign policy, we have a feminist government. I think that issues like health insurance and paid holidays, that should not be an issue. We all need basic security, and we need this to be function as human beings, men or women. And here, of course, a key is jurisdiction. And I always say that we have some very, very important reforms. It's the individual taxation that lets women go out in the labor market without losing money. Right now, we have the highest number of women taking part in the labor force in any country in the world. Our number of foreign-born women are higher than compare, for example, with Germany, with German-born women, because we say that every individual should have a job and should be able to have their own economic empowerment. This is also key for taking part in every other issue, being active in the trade union, being active, like I work a lot with women, peace and security. If you don't have the economic empowerment for women, you don't have the other issues as well. And the key here is jurisdiction, of course. That is, you need to have the laws in place. So the cooperation with all those three, that's the key. I don't know if it was 90 seconds, I tried.
That was an excellent effort, and I think you succeeded more than just trying. Let me ask Thea, one of the issues in women's empowerment and the interaction with the labor movement is the degree to which we have women leaders in the labor movement, and whether there is a deficiency of that, a lack of that. Did we have in that sense a gendered or somewhat patriarchal labor movement here and around the world? Thea, what's your take on that?
Thanks, Harold, for that question. And I mean, I think this is something that every labor movement has struggled with at some point. And, you know, there's different paces of progress. Of course, the AFL-CIO has a new woman president, Liz Schuler, which is very exciting, the very first time in the history of the AFL-CIO. So we're thrilled about that. And I think, you know, certainly we've seen in the United States that there was a real concentrated effort to bring more women into leadership positions in the labor movement. Never quite enough, but definitely it took a lot of effort and a lot of rules from the top of requiring delegations to be more balanced, both gender and racially. And but at the end of the day, you know, the labor movement is a democratic institution, so leaders are elected. But, you know, around the world, we definitely see that there are challenges. And so this is something that we are trying to help. You know, the iLab, my little agency, is supporting women in leadership positions in the Mexican labor movement, for example, as part of our USMCA work. But I'm sure Kathy has more to add on this front, because the labor movement is taking this on head on. And I think that's been a really important set of efforts.
Well, I was just about to ask Kathy the same thing, and you just did. So Kathy, now the AFL-CIO, for the first time in its history, has a woman president, Liz Schuler. What's your take on women in labor leadership?
That this is part of the transformation we're talking about, putting women at the center, but women leaders who actually come with a feminist-centered agenda. Let me just say, the transformation at the AFL-CIO is part of a global transformation. We have new leadership in the Japanese labor movement. A woman just took over there. We have the Canadian labor movement just elected their first, woman president. We have in Norway, Denmark, the UK, Frances O'Grady. So we have an amazing cohort, the Kuta Brazil, amazing cohort. The other thing that we are doing in the labor movement, the International Trade Union Confederation, I'm helping lead a bench building program. So we, over these past 2 years, one of the positive things of COVID is we have a virtual leadership development program, building our bench. And we really were able to identify women leaders who came out during the ILO conversation and negotiation around the Gender-Based Violence Convention 190. Many of us spent many hours in Geneva. I'm looking at you, Gabriella, and others who were in that room. But for the labor movement, it really became a place of emerging women's leadership. They saw the power they have to shape global frameworks that they then bring home, and they're able to organize and build power for themselves. So that was a really effective way of starting to spark more leadership development in our movement.
Well, Gabriella, since you were in the room with Kathy, talk some about women's empowerment from the perspective of U.S. corporations that go abroad. I know in California. A law was passed that California corporations need to boost women's membership on corporate boards. I don't know that in itself will create any revolutions, but talk about, from the point of view of US-based corporations that deal globally, the question of women's empowerment and what actually those corporations can do. And can they do more actually in other countries that might not quite have the same kind of gendered dual labor markets and things that we seem to have here in the United States?
What a good question, Harold. And just to round out the great progress with women, I would note that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce also has a woman president for the first time in its history, which is very welcome, Suzanne Clark. And so, we're getting progress in a number of areas, but as we've discussed already today, way more is needed. Internationally, I'm glad you brought up, other jurisdictions and other practices in other countries. This is a real challenge for business, but for trade unions like AFL-CIO and the International Trade Union Confederation and governments like Department of Labor as well. I mean, it's a shared concern. One of the challenges is that our women around the world are facing legislative barriers and discriminatory legislation. Just as an example, 104 economies still prevent women from working in certain jobs simply because they're women. 59 economies, there are no laws on sexual harassment in the workplace. And in 18 economies, husbands can legally prevent their wives from working. So what can employers do? They can work to advance best practices in the workplace where the laws don't meet our standards, but businesses alone are not going to be able to solve this challenge. Removing legal restrictions that hinder women from participating in the formal labor market and having formal self-employment opportunities, such as proper access to finance, for female entrepreneurs, is just one of the examples of the key inequalities that we need to address. And it's going to take all of us together.
Well, staying on the topic of corporations that go global, if I could ask a question of Minister Linda, there are a lot of European manufacturing companies as well as Japanese manufacturing companies that come to the United States and have opened considerable facilities here. They tend to go to southern states where forming a union for a variety of reasons is much more difficult and arduous, and they tend to adapt to the local labor practices, which, to put it mildly, are not the highest. How do you folks deal with the situation of European companies which are flexible, perhaps not in the most exemplary way, when they come to the United States?
Well, thank you. Just let me just say again that I think it's totally unacceptable not to both allow unionization, organization, collective bargaining, and also to kind of try to get unequal opportunities for different parts. As I said when I answered the question you asked before, also here, jurisdiction is key. It really goes back to what I said about outsourcing, that when a company is outsourcing production to a different market, if the legal framework is not rigorous, it will have an impact. And we need to strengthen the social dialogue to make up for such challenges. And we see this, of course, also a lot in the European Union, where we struggle with this and we have a lot of fights about this. But we need to also inform consumers about these aspects, and since they all have the power. And I remember a few years ago when I was in Hong Kong, when it was still able to talk with trade unions there. Now, unfortunately, the situation is so grave, it's not even possible because they jail trade unionists and so on. They told me about the outsourcing, that they have asked that they wanted the same benefits as the big companies on the same plant where all the companies were. And the owner of the company said, when you can give me as much profit as IKEA, we will grant you the same rights as the workers as IKEA have. But when you are just a small company giving parts to IKEA, then we decide what should be your rights and benefits. And of course, that's totally unacceptable. And that's also why this issue of outsourcing and having not so good possibilities to work in unions is so very important. And here I think all of us need to work together to strengthen, for example, Global Deal. I was Minister of Trade before, and to try to get more companies and unions and governments to go in, it's important. As an example, the latest that joined Global Deal was the government, the trade union, and the employers organization in Israel. All of the three partners joined Global Deal, and I think that is also something very positive. Thank you.
In the state of Israeli politics, it's rare that any rival sectors join anything together in Israel. So that's an encouraging story. We have a question from our viewers, but before we go there, Thia wants to say something. So Thia, please do.
Thank you, Harold. I wanted to sort of jump in on the point that Minister Linda was making about outsourcing and sort of where the ultimate leverage point or control is. And for us, I think one of the key things is market access and access to the US market, which is, and of course, to the European Union market as well. And I think it's really important that we are consistent around addressing workers' rights, including non-discrimination on the basis of sex or race. And that is one of the core worker rights that is embedded in a lot of US trade agreements and trade preference programs. And I think, certainly we're seeing a global movement. We saw it at the G7, where there is additional attention to supply chains and forced labor and trying to make sure that we're getting forced labor and child labor out of our supply chains. To me, the key place to do that is at the consumer market for governments to use and enforce and put in place and close loopholes on market access with respect for internationally recognized ILO core workers' rights. And so that's just another really important tool in the toolbox that I wanted to throw into the mix. Thanks.
Thank you. And of course, the US MCA under trade agreement with Mexico, your Labor Department, the Biden administration Labor Department, was able actually to pose that sort of issue in the context of ensuring a small lowercase d democratic election for worker representation in a factory in Mexico. So that certainly was for those of us concerned with these things, a heartening example. And Gabriella is now raising her hand as well. So Gabriella.
Just, Harold, I'm glad this topic's come up, and just to weigh in, I'd like to emphasize, and go a bit deeper on the earlier point I was making about the role of the state and the diversity of tools. And I fully agree with Deputy Undersecretary Lee. We have a range of tools and approaches. A number of them are addressing symptoms, but we're really interested in solving for the problem and getting to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, regrettably, is poor rule of law and systemic endemic challenges at national levels that we all have an interest in resolving. And that's why I had this emphasis on the key role of sound national institutions characterized by good governance, rule of law, transparency, and strong anti-corruption practices. Because the very challenges that Minister Linda was emphasizing at the other end of the supply chains, the point is that every business in the world is housed in a jurisdiction covered by national laws. And we need to be pushing together for ways to enhance enforcement on national firms everywhere of international labor standards, of national laws that meet international labor standards, and then the effective enforcement of those as well domestically. So thank you.
Thank you. We're running short of time, so I'm gonna pose one question which came in from our viewers to Kathy, and then we'll go to wrapping it up. And that question is, can you recommend some NGOs that offer effective programs to help women empowerment in the supply chain, which Lord knows stretches everywhere. So Kathy?
Absolutely. Well, I would say the Labor Movement Solidarity Center, Global Labor Justice, ILRF, just did an event this week around women in supply chains. And Harold, if I may just really quickly also address Jill, former sister from NEA, a question around domestic and informal work, because I think we come full circle to the care economy, which is going to be key to the recovery. And I just wanted to give some examples that this has actually been a win during this time. We have seen that in Chile, domestic workers have won the right to unemployment insurance during the pandemic. Dominican Republic, South Africa, and the Philippines, domestic workers were included in the government relief programs. As you've seen in the United States, Thea mentioned it, we've got another bill coming. We want to see some wins for domestic workers and care providers in our own country. That is going to be pivotal to creating a new economic model. I wanted to bring us back. I mean, really, it's about expanding the model so that it's inclusive to all workers, to women who are in domestic care work, home-based work. And I really think that is the challenge that's before us. They are throughout all of these supply chains we were just talking about. When we can lift up supply chains, and I'll just end on some of the comments people were making, we need this to be worker-driven. It can no longer be top-down fancy statements. It needs to be worker-driven, enforceable, building off of the USMCA model. And those are the tools that workers need. Those are tools that women need to address discrimination and inequality in the workplace.
Amen. And I think we're going to go to some brief closing statements from our panelists. Kathy, that was so eloquent, and given the shortage of time, I'm going to take that as your closing statement. But if we can hear from Thea and Gabriella, I don't know what has become of the minister, but she's on a tighter schedule than we are. But if there's a particular takeaway, just briefly, very briefly from Thea, can we go?
Thank you, Harold. And it's been a great panel. Thanks to all the panelists, and particularly great to be here with the Swedish government. And what I would say, I want to reiterate what Kathy said, like we're at a moment right now, this is post-pandemic, and how important it is for business and labor and governments to come together around empowering workers and empowering women, which is two sides of the same coin, that if women don't have the protections in the workforce, and they don't have the professional and affordable care that they need. And all of that is in the Build Back Better bill. So we really are looking forward to strong support from the US and the global business community for these important next steps. These are crucial. We're right at the cusp of being able to do something very important, and we're looking forward to it. So thank you, Harold, also for your very skillful moderation.
We shall see about that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Gabriella, some closing thought.
Absolutely. And just to offer that another important local partner to support the advancement of women's economic empowerment is national employer organizations, as well as the international employer confederations, which have networks to support and encourage the national employers to be able to contribute and empower their members to advance worker rights, human rights, women's rights internationally and nationally. And I would just conclude by thanking you for including USCIB among the US tripartite partners in today's discussion. We have an opportunity to shape the post-pandemic world that's more inclusive and fairer to women. And we've got to break through the pull of the status quo and instead look to a future with equal opportunities throughout society, especially for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella. And since America does not really have a robust social dialogue, I'm very glad that you're here. And I would hope a number of American corporations would understand that it's in their interest to have things like childcare made affordable, made accessible, made a real occupation that is a decent one in the United States if they want to get women back into their workforce. It would not be bad if a few corporations actually supported the Build Back Better bill. That would be, I think, very helpful in the context of American politics. We don't have Minister Linda, and I presume that whoever is sitting in her place either does or does not have a statement to make, a closing statement?
That is correct, although I could give a sentence that I think the minister would have given if she had still been here. She's so
Please
sorry
do.
she had to leave. She had something very, very important, but I will just have a sentence. And that is, in the years to come, transition will be key and workers need to be on board, especially if we are going to achieve a green economy. Thank you so much for having us.
Well, thank you, and thank the Swedish ministry for somewhat engendering this event in both senses of engender. We really appreciate your participation, that of all our panelists, that of our audience, and we're going to go back now for a closing remark to Kevin Cassidy of the ILO. Kevin.
Right. Harold, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to a close of today's program. Please join me in thanking our speakers for their contributions to this fascinating discussion on a vital issue for a better world of work. Foreign Minister of Sweden, Ann Linde, Karin Olastather, the Ambassador of Sweden to the US, Thia Lee, the Department of Labor's Deputy Undersecretary for International Labor, AFL-CIO Director for International Programs, Kathy Feingold, and Gabriela Rigg-Herzog, Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Labor Affairs for the U.S. Council for International Business. Also, a special thanks to you, Harold, for your excellent moderation to today's event, as well as your undeniable commitment to the improvement of workers' lives and the achievement of decent work. I'd also like to thank those behind the scenes, Petra Hansen and her colleague Britt, and my colleague Andrea Sanchez, who has set up all the technology backend on this. To our audiences, thank you very much for your time. I trust you found this an exciting and informative program. Please visit the ILO website for further information and research on the human-centered approach to building back better from COVID-19. And please join us on the 7th of December, where we'll have a very special edition of the Global Discussion Series, Ending Gender-Based Violence in the Workplace, which is being held on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Global 16 Days campaign, which focuses on raising awareness about violence against women. I hope you've enjoyed this inspiring and important discussion as much as I have. We look to all of you to do your best to help put gender equality at the heart of decent work. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you all.